Hello there, and welcome to Whiskey Lore. I'm Drew Hanish, and we have today with us a special guest who has come by way of Down Under, Australia. And this is founder of Starward Whiskey, Dave Vitale. Dave, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Drew. Thanks for having me on.
So this is fun because usually when I am thinking about going out of the country for whiskey, I think of going east. And now I get to go really far southwest. And here we go into Australia, which is a country that, people probably assume they make whiskey in Australia, and the rest of the world is assuming that. But we don't really know a whole lot of the specifics, how long the whiskey industry has been around down there, and where the industry is right now. So I wanted to jump into some of that history and then also talk a little later on about special designation that you now have with the Michelin Guide, which we can talk about. And we can talk a little bit about Melbourne, where you come from, and some about the distillery and some of the culture around that area as well. So let's jump right in. How about it?
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's talk about Australian whiskey history, just to kind of get everybody situated with where we are today. When the whiskey industry came to Australia, it was, of course, we think of people migrating down from England, and so I'm sure there were people who had distilling skills that they brought along with them. What was kind of the origination of the whiskey industry in Australia?
Yeah, so it actually, in terms of distilling skills, very early on, it was focused on rum in Sydney, actually. That was kind of the starting point of distillation. And obviously there's a very big rum distillery that's in the sugarcane fields in tropical North Queensland now, called Bundaberg, and they kind of have the molasses literally like right there, and then distill and age the rum on site, and that's been popular. Well, I'm going to say since the late 19th century. You know. But whiskey kind of came of age in my hometown and my home state of Victoria in the late 19th century. I'm going to say the late 1860s. Melbourne and San Francisco shared two things, or one thing in common at that point in time. They were the two richest cities in the world, off the back of the gold rush. And so wherever you have miners, you'll have distillation, and miners is in ERS.
Yeah.
Not ORS. Yeah.
Right.
So we had a very thriving whiskey industry that kind of hung on the coattails of that mining boom. And so the first large-scale distillery was producing. I'm pretty sure that it's set on a volcano. I know the site very well. It had both natural mineral water and spring water as well. So like it had bubbly water and literally, the width of a dining table. On one side you had the spring that was sourcing fizzy water, and the other side was natural spring water. So they were able to kind of make amazing beer. Malted barley was growing in abundance at the time. And from that beer, they then distilled both barley gin, as they called it at the time, and single malt whiskey. So that was kind of the starting point of like commercial whiskey production. It was in the late 1860s, and from there, the industry kind of grew. There were 4 or 5 different distilleries, both in the gold mining regions, which are about 60 miles north of Melbourne, but also in Port Melbourne, where our distillery is at the moment. There are, at the beginning of the 20th century, we were that little pocket of Melbourne was making the most amount of whiskey in the Southern Hemisphere at that time. So it was a very, very big distilling industry, and all backed off single malt whiskey because we just had an abundance of malted barley growing.
That's amazing. So, I mean, I've done stories on Campbelltown, Scotland, and how many distilleries they had. They had 30 at one time and called themselves the whiskey capital of the world. Was Melbourne getting anywhere close to that?
Approaching 30. I don't think at that point in time we had quite 30, but there were certainly 5 or 6 in Melbourne that were, very big distilleries. Like, so the throughput that they were making was quite substantial, like, in the millions of liters of alcohol a year.
Yeah.
For a population of like 100,000 people, like it was a small community. So we were, solely drinking locally made whiskey. There's lovely records that kind of talk about, and I think it might have been slightly protectionist, but the talk about, imposing minimum requirements on whiskey because, the quality and caliber of the product made domestically compared to the imported stuff from Scotland was, inferior in their minds, and they needed to make sure that there were controls in place.
Did it ever get to that point that they did?
Well, it did, and in 1901, when we became a federation, the first laws were enshrined on whiskey, and they still persist today. There's only been one small change to the regulation, but basically at that time, it was, whiskey was defined as a fermented grain mash that's distilled and aged in wood for a minimum of 2 years. And I think Canada is the only country that predates that age statement in legislation. So we were the first countries in the world outside of Canada. You'd think it would have been Scotland or the United Kingdom, Ireland, but no, it was the outposts that kind of implemented a minimum age statement. So ours is, to this day is still fermented grain mash aged in wood for a minimum of 2 years. And it's very elegantly simple is the way I kind of phrase it, Drew, because it touches on everything that you need to do well and to call it a whiskey. But you can shoot a cannon through it in terms of innovation.
Yeah.
Which is the exciting thing, which we'll get to later on.
Excellent. Yeah, I was going to say and we'll talk about sort of the environment issues you have to deal with. But in a way, when I hear 2 years and I think about extremes, I go, wow, actually, that seems like it could be limiting in itself in that one aspect, but to have everything else opened up,
Yeah, look, and I think, Texas in the United States is probably the closest we get to those sorts of extremes, in terms of high temperatures and low for that matter. And then we've got other places around the world now, like Taiwan, producing amazing whiskies. Israel is, and they're doing crazy things like aging the whiskey in the Dead Sea or adjacent to the Dead Sea. So age is just that. It's a statement of age. Really, maturity kind of is impacted by the environment, and we say at Starward that it takes 3 Melbourne years to age our whiskey. So 2's a good age gate, actually. It needs a little longer than that, but you do need to be careful as to how you age the whiskey in that environment, because you could end up, even after 2 years, spitting out wood chips if you're not careful.
So, as I understand it, there got to be a point where the Australian whiskey industry got down to just a couple of distilleries and then actually just disappeared for a while. How did that all come about?
Yeah, so in the 1920s, so we should also add that part of that 1901 regulation was implementing a minimum still size, which was protectionist. It was basically the existing distilleries saying, you know what, we're onto a good thing here. We don't want more distillers. And so we're going to each take a look at our still sizes and then make a mandate. And I might get this wrong, but it was 1,000 gallons, which is 5,000 liters. Now, we just, after 15 years of production with a really strong investment mandate to make as much whiskey as we want to sell around the world, have just purchased a still that's a bit bigger than 5,000 liters.
Wow.
So it's about 1,000 gallons in American talk. So it was a big hurdle that they kind of put in the way in 1901 as part of that regulation, and so in the mid 1920s, Scotland started to take a keen interest in the in what was going on in Australia. And the precursor to what is now Diageo, the maker of Johnny Walker and amazing single malts in the reserve portfolio, took a 50% interest in a new distillery that was going to be established about 60 miles west of Melbourne. But if you think, the north and the west kind of made a lovely triangle of like where barley's grown, right? So where the barley was grown and where the city was and where this particular distillery was located was perfect geography. And that distillery was called Corio Distillery, and it was set up in the 1920s as a joint venture between the
Distillers Company Limited, I think, isn't it? That's
correct.
That was, yeah.
So it was basically an amalgamation of all of those founding distilleries that made it through that sort of 1900 period. And so that was a huge consolidation of the industry at that point in time in 1920. There are other distilleries, the Gilbey's distillery. I mean, Gilbey's is a famous gin brand, right? Like that was established, in Melbourne, a little south of Melbourne, and others that were making. Federal Distillery was around at that point in time as well. And so there were other distilleries, but they were it for a very long time. The good news is, for a very long time, up until, well, we'll get to that, but in the 50s and 60s, when single malt was starting to kind of become a thing around the world, we were still the number. Australians were drinking Australian whiskey, and it was great quality Australian whiskey. And we've been able to source some barrels from the old Corio Distillery. And when you look at the layers of paint, and if you carefully chip away layers of paint, you find that these barrels were actually ex-whiskey barrels from Scotland that were used to age then Australian whiskey in.
Okay.
It was a lighter style whiskey. It wasn't sort of like poke you in the eyes and big sherry bombs or anything like that, or port bombs. Notwithstanding, we still make a lot of sherry and port in Australia. It's diminishing, but there's a lot of it. So we were sourcing these barrels from wherever we could and recycling them and filling them, and coming back to that definition. Fermented grain mash that's distilled and aged in wood. It made no mention of oak.
Right. No charring.
American oak or French oak or charring or fill strengths. None of that, right?
Yeah.
The wood policy that was used at the time was very resourceful, right? Like, it was what was available to be able to be used. I've had some of that early stuff, and it's light in style.
Yeah. These are probably third fill, fourth fill barrels that you're getting.
Yeah.
Yeah. From the DLC or DCL, which is mass producing all over Scotland.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so they were sent over and then and repurposed. And so we like the rest of the world, became fascinated with Scottish single malts. And obviously the first one to arrive in Australia officially as a single malt whiskey was the Glenfiddich. And in fact, if you ever go to the Glenfiddich distillery, there's an amazing kind of video directed by Ridley Scott, no less.
Really?
That they kind of that they run for the at the beginning of the tour. And if you look very carefully, they talk about exporting barrels, like single barrels around the world. And one of them went to Melbourne. You can see him writing in the book, like Melbourne, Australia. So we were very much on the whiskey map very early on, and Glenfiddich kind of spearheaded it in Australia, and is still, I think, for the time being, until Starward kind of gets, the number one single malt sold in Australia. So
Wow.
like incumbency is a very powerful thing. But over from about the 50s and 60s down to the 80s, there was a slow decline in both production and consumption of Australian whiskey, and that was part due to economic forces, but also as international whiskies became a little bit more ambitious about their export plans, particularly in the 80s, Australian whiskey's relevance kind of was diminished. And, there's quite a sad sort of end to that history. Like most people, like a generation older than me, kind of think of Corio whiskey as like rocket fuel,
Nice. Yeah.
And there's a very good reason for that. There was the stills were in desperate need of kind of refurbishment, and they were neglected for quite some years. And part of the reason was that they were owned by an international company at that point in time who had a vested interest in supporting the local market with their own product as opposed to the domestic product. And so in 1986, the distillery was closed down. The last of those distilleries was closed down. And so ended the original kind of distillation from the 1860s, legitimate whiskey distillation. I'm sure there was lots of illicit stuff going on before and after that time. But, we had a long continuous run of premium whiskey production in Australia from like the late 1860s right through to the 1980s. And, if you think about legitimate whiskey production in the United States, there was a huge gap in the middle there, right, with prohibition.
Yeah.
So, it's funny to think of, and even Australians wouldn't think of it this way. It's funny to think that Australia had a longer continuous history of making whiskey for home consumption than America did, because of the prohibition, and so it's quite funny. No one thinks of it that way, but we've got a very deep love for whiskey even today, and it's rooted in the gold rush.
Yeah. And then to get a distilling industry started again, or to get even a single craft distillery with that 1901 law that's not going to really help a small craft distillery get off the ground. How did this, because now there's at least 40, 50 distilleries.
And upwards of 200 in development, so it's a big industry, and Drew, it's quite interesting, it could have been over, and that's it.
Yeah.
No one would have kind of ever thought to make whiskey in Australia or any distilled spirit, because that minimum requirement was for all distilled spirits, not just whiskey. And so, look, what we had a vibrant brandy production environment, and it was used, most of the fortification of grape or wine. Sorry, I should say that differently. Most of the distillation of wine was made for fortifying spirit for sherry and port.
Okay.
So that was kind of why those brandy distilleries kind of persisted, was because they were taking thousands and thousands of liters of sub-grade wine and then turning it into fortification spirit for use in sherry and port, which was quite popular. But outside of the brandy industry, there was no real, and that one rum distillery.
Yeah.
There was no real distilling scene at all in Australia, and certainly not in whiskey. And then in 1992, the founding father of, I guess, the modern craft spirits industry, not just whiskey, went fishing with his father-in-law. His name's Bill Lark. He went fishing with his father-in-law in the Highlands of Tasmania, which is very Scotland-like, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm pretty sure it was Glenfarclas, but he was drinking some Glenfarclas after having gone fishing, and he said, you know, we grow barley here. We have amazing water and like a very similar climate to Scotland. Why isn't anyone making whiskey? Now he's a land surveyor, right? Like that's his day job.
Yeah.
But Bill's quite inventive and notwithstanding he's quite traditional, he's anti-establishment as well, right? So he was like, I'm going to find out why and what we can do about this. And so he started to look at the regulations and found this minimum kind of threshold, which was never going to work. And so he went to his local, as everyone should, right? Went to his local member of parliament, government, and said, why is this regulation in here? And he said, well, you know what? I'm not sure why either, but I've actually got a call with the Minister for, innovation and who takes care of tax regulation as well. So I'll bring it up with him and see what he comes back with. Anyway, came back and the minister at the time said, yeah, that's a silly law. Tell Bill that he can get started on making some whiskey and we'll change it. How small does he want it to be?
Wow.
And they changed it to 5 liters, which is
5 liters, gallon. Really?
So they went from 1,000 gallons to 1 gallon being the minimum.
Wow.
Size. Now you still need to go through a licensing process and all sorts of things. So in as much as you can be a home brewer and a home winemaker, you can't be a home distiller in Australia, right? Like so, any still greater than 5 liters needs to be licensed and registered with the government, and so on and so forth. And so off he went. He went and started to make literally on his kitchen bench, started to make Australia's first single malt whiskey. In 6 years, right? But the first licensed distillery in Tasmania in 150 years.
Wow.
So,
and that's a pretty popular area for whiskey distillation now, isn't it?
It is. Look, in terms of today, if we talk about the Campbelltown being I think Tasmania rightfully holds the kind of it's the epicenter of whiskey production today in terms of number of distilleries, but interestingly in terms of volume produced, very low on the so it's a lot of very well crafted artisanal products, and I think that for them the ambition is to like really fully embrace the tourism opportunity, because that's what Tasmania is known for domestically and internationally for that matter. The wilderness there is amazing. 40% of the island is just World Heritage listed wilderness. So it's paradise. It's a beautiful place to visit, and I can't wait to get back there. So both for the whiskey and for the natural environment.
Yeah.
But it's quite artisanal and small scale, and that's representative of most of those distilleries that we were talking about beforehand. That really they're in the regions, they're in regional Australia, with smaller populations, and their ambition, I don't want to speak for them, but by and large is the domestic market for sure. Fortunately for them, they're able to sell. They can have a tasting room that is able to sell direct to consumers, and so that sort of margin that they're able to keep means that they can continue to invest in more whiskey as time goes by. But Drew, I have to say, I'd take the keys to any Australian whiskey distillery, such as the quality that's coming out of Australia, and call it my own. Honestly, like it's all amazing whiskey, and it comes back to that definition that we spoke of earlier, that you can shoot a cannon through it. And the amazing thing is that there's just so much diversity in the category now. That means that whiskey drinkers can have a lot of fun exploring all of the different variances and approaches that whiskey makers are making at the moment.
So in your area of Melbourne, would you say that it traditionally was a wine drinking area, a beer drinking area, or a closet whiskey drinking area?
All of the above. I think I mean, beer by a long margin in terms of volume. And we had for a very long time the largest brewery in Australia was located in Melbourne and served the nation's beer.
Yeah.
We've got amazing wine growing regions within 50 miles of Melbourne, downtown Melbourne. We've got, within a day's drive, we've also got amazing wine growing regions in South Australia, which is another state, but it's about an 8-hour drive away. And, for Americans, I'm glad, when I say it's 8 hours away in Europe, people think you just kind of cross two countries.
That's a 2-week vacation for me to get there. Yeah. or
I'll
never go.
8 hours is a different kind of, it's the same sort of sense of scale as it does for Australians. Not far away, and so, wine's a big part of like our drinking repertoire, and whiskey's always been there, like it's still the pinnacle of flavor in my view, in terms of, when it comes to sort of complexity and certainly in some instances intensity of flavor. Like nothing kind of holds a torch to whiskey. And I think that as your palate develops, that's where you kind of gravitate towards, is things that are a bit more intense and have a bit more complexity to them. And that's why, outside of teenagers and people that shouldn't be drinking, people kind of graduate from beer into wine, into harder liquor as they grow older. What we've seen, I think, globally over the last 15 years for sure has been a compression of that time scale.
Yeah.
And a promiscuity, I guess, across all of those three drinks and the three, beer, wine, and spirits, but also within spirits itself, people will drink gin or vodka or whiskey.
Yeah.
Excuse me 1 second. We've just had a dog arrive.
What's that?
No worries. I was just saying, we just had a dog arrive, so there might be a bark or two.
Okay.
See how we go.
That's okay. I got to hear a lawnmower on my last interview, so it happens.
Right.
So, and it's an interesting point, because that was my journey. I started out in beer. I drank beer most of my life. My initial experience with whiskey was not a good one, but the purpose for drinking whiskey back then was different, which was I didn't care what it tasted like. I was going to chase it with something, so it just needed to get the job done. And that was kind of the philosophy on it. And then I just got tired of beer after a while. It's like everybody's telling me what it is and what it's supposed to taste like. And I see these wine drinkers, and they're all sitting here discussing their wines. I've never really discussed a beer other than say that that's hoppy, or that's, here's the basic element of it that I find interesting. And
I don't know about you, but like for me, I guess beer consumption was really had one role, and that was refreshment.
Right. Absolutely.
Mowing the lawn.
Yeah.
Finishing up and then just cracking, the cracking a can of icy cold beer was just the best way to end an afternoon.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Whereas I think, when we're starting to think about wine, it is a different occasion, right? I mean, refreshment nowadays with all of the frosés and all the things, right? And rosés and moscatos.
Right.
But, back in the day, it was, really a different occasion. It was about discernment, and certainly with food and good company. And let's not ignore the fact that I think the craft beer movement also helped kind of move beer into that a bit more of a discerning sort of space. But by and large, you're absolutely right. Like, we kind of historically, we kind of graduated into a different occasion for drinking. And with that came more dialogue, I guess, about what we're drinking to.
Yeah.
And, there's a magical thing about, and I've learned more about winemaking, making whiskey than I ever did being a drinker, funnily enough. And we'll talk about why later on. But the interesting thing for me is that there is so much more scope for variation and for discussion, and approach with a winemaker. And also, Mother Nature's their business partner. So from season to season, it's also going to change as well.
Yeah.
So, between just the seasons and an approach of the winemaker, you could be neighbors with a winery and make two completely different wines from the same grape.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, and then different years, you're going to have different experiences.
Yeah.
If it's a dry year, if it's a overly wet season, whatever it may be, can really. And I've even tasted that in whiskey before. I've heard of someone once told me if you buy Weller 12 here, it has good years and bad years. It's like sometimes the crops were good, sometimes the weather was better, sometimes the weather wasn't. I'm like, that's interesting, because I wouldn't have thought you really could have gotten that out of a whiskey.
Yeah, look, I mean, absolutely you can. I think, we're starting with grains, and I think today when you're talking about the fire hydrant of spirit coming out of some of the larger distilleries, the variations being kind of almost programmed out of their production process, because, they want to deliver on a promise of consistency to the drinker from batch to batch. But certainly it's something that we've explored and validated. There's, and we're not Robinson Crusoe in doing that. Not just a Starward or Australian distilleries. There's a, amazing distillery in the Pacific Northwest called Westland that kind of has built a reputation out of that in terms of kind of really anchoring the terroir of whiskey to the barley that's grown in the regions. And sort of, I think it's a fascinating conversation that, needs to be discussed more and more of, because obviously the oak, the barrel that we're aging whiskey in, has so much influence on the character of the whiskey, but it's not all of the influence.
Yeah.
And the way I'm a frustrated home brewer, that's kind of my story coming into whiskey. I wanted to kind of initially set up an organic Tasmanian beer. That was my ambition, but good beer doesn't travel well, right? Like, we know that.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't be talking today. So, for me, the next step up was, and that's how I actually got introduced to Bill, that the founding father, Bill Lark of whiskey, and I worked with Bill for 2.5 years, sort of like helping them scale up their operations and learning how to make whiskey and learning how not to make whiskey too. Because I think at that point in time, where do you look if you're making single malt whiskey? Where are you going to look to? You're going to look to Scotland and see how that's kind of what are the boundaries of like making quality whiskey, and so the early distillers in Australia were very much anchored in the finest of, in fact, one of them said, we make Tasmanian whiskey in the finest of Scottish traditions. That had relevance in the 90s, right? When like they're trying to sell this hand to hand, right?
Yeah.
And so they're, without any kind of credentials so they needed that kind of anchoring point for both the consumer and themselves. But off the back of them being able to prove that they could do that in the finest of Scottish traditions, now all of them, including those distilleries that started at that point, are starting to branch out and be a bit more innovative. And that was my kind of start into whiskey, was like, well, I know how we've definitely proven that Australia can make great whiskey, right? And historically we were doing it. So that's not my job to do.
Yeah.
Right. We've done that. The job that we need to do is to get it out of the special occasion cabinet as this kind of obscure kind of memento from a visit to a place, into the sharing cabinet alongside great bourbons, great Scotch, great Irish whiskey, more recently Japanese whiskey, is something that people can kind of gravitate to and choose for themselves that evening because it stands for something different to all those other whiskeys.
Yeah. And so the thing that Bill would not have been familiar with, he would have known about Australia's climate, but he wasn't having to distill in a place like Melbourne where the temperature and humidity and the rest is going to be very different from the way it is in Tasmania. So how did you go about figuring this out?
Yeah, so for some context, for those that are listening, like we basically Melbourne's kind of geographically unique in the world in that we have not much between the city and the outback, a big desert in the center of the country that everybody's familiar with. And so, the predominant winds in Australia are coming from the west. So if it's blowing from the northwest into the southeastern corner where Melbourne is, it's hot, dry winds. Like right now, and you'll see it if anybody's curious about the Australian Open, you'll see we'll get upwards of 105, 110 degrees Fahrenheit for days in a row. But they'll be punctuated with huge swings down into the 60s because we've got another desert that's nearby. It's called Antarctica. And so if the wind is coming from the southwest, it's freezing cold, humid, picking up a lot of humidity off the water and coming into Melbourne, again, uninterrupted. It's just coming straight in. And so we've got these two huge influences into the climate of Melbourne. And so it makes for quite dramatic weather, very frustrating to live in terms of like, we don't know what you're going to get at the end of the day. But amazing place to age whiskey in because we do genuinely have 4 seasons in a day.
Yeah.
And, as I said earlier, like in 3 Melbourne years, we come up with this amazing, well-crafted whiskey that's quite balanced in character and flavor that would take, upwards of 8 to 10 years in Kentucky and 12 plus years in Scotland if we just used evaporative losses as a measure.
Yeah.
And so the challenge for me was in 2 parts. The first was that no one was really doing this at scale. We needed, so that was a challenge. And we were using, we had this, huge diurnal range to manage. And so like, I'm going to start crafting whiskey at scale. We're an unknown quantity. What if it all comes to age sooner than I'm able to kind of monetize it?
Yeah.
Or conversely, what if I haven't, what if I've undercooked it and it's going to take longer than I thought? So there was quite a big process that went into kind of crafting the wood policy at the distillery to manage for that. And what we did was basically hedged our bets by filling smaller barrels, about 13-gallon barrels, 26-gallon barrels, and the standard 50, 55-gallon barrels that we're familiar with bourbon. Yeah. So we could kind of then think about production from a portfolio perspective or blending the whiskies at the end of that so that we had light and shade. We had, an abundance of extraction from those smaller barrels. We had, some balance in the middle with the 100-liter barrels, the 26-gallon barrels, and, some light, delicate characteristics coming from the 200-liter casks. And the initial thinking, Drew, was that actually we'd launched with the 13s, moved to the 26s after a year or two, and then sort of stabilize on our larger format barrels. And look, over what is it now, nearly 15 years of production, that's kind of where we've ended up. But actually those first few years, the spirit was ready. What we were able to do was come up with a far more, the spirit was ready in the 50s and it was ready in the 200s, right? What we were able to come up with is a far more complex whiskey because we had that light and shade, right? Coming from those 3 barrels, so that hedging the bets turned out to be not what how can I put it? It was unanticipated. I could have released any of those 3 whiskeys, those barrel shapes, but the sum of the parts made a better whiskey than any 3 could have made originally. So that was a big, lucky coincidence for me. And that first product that we brought to market was called Solera. It's available in the States on allocation because using a traditional method of of production in fortified wines, we basically vat the 50, 100 and 200 liter barrels after they've aged for 3 Melbourne years
Yeah.
into a large container. And if you think of a bottomless cup of coffee, we only take out 20% for every release of Solera. So, and then top it up with aged whiskey again. So it's always aged whiskey that we're just topping up.
Yeah.
And so every single barrel that we've released at Starward is in your bottle, which is pretty amazing.
That is amazing. Yeah.
And makes for a really consistent whiskey, because that was really important to me. You know, if we think about the whiskeys that like I admire and have been a huge influence on me, there's 5 of them. You know, Johnny Walker Black. I mean, I'll go through them and then we can talk a little bit more about them if you want. So
Yeah.
Johnny Walker Black was one. Maker's Mark, very different, right?
Yeah.
The Belveni Doublewood.
Okay.
Lafroig 10-year-old, and Wild Turkey 101.
Nice.
Really different, broad.
Yeah.
Right.
That's a good, I mean, if you had a whiskey cabinet with those 5 whiskeys, you've got a lot of areas covered.
Correct. And my ambition was to be inspired by them because they're amazing whiskeys. But if I want to sit next to them in my sharing cabinet, as we discussed beforehand, I can't be any of those 5 things. Right. Because it's done. Yeah. It's already done.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the mindset that I came to whiskey with. The love of it spelt both ways from around the world, with a huge amount of reverence towards what had been achieved by those whiskeys particularly, and others, of course, you know. But with a strong conviction that if we're going to be relevant and move out of being, you know, and be a player in the international whiskey scene, just as Japanese whiskey is and Irish whiskey is and Scotch and bourbon is, then we've got to stand up for something else. And that kind of talks to the second part of aging, which was the complexity at Starward. So 50s, 100s, 200s kind of mitigated the climate early on until we kind of found our feet and had enough inventory to sort of be wiser with our decision making, you know, with experience. The second was that we were aging exclusively, and we still do, in Australian wine barrels. So I can count on maybe 2 hands the non-wine barrels that are in there. And it won't be any surprise, for years and years and years, we had 4 ex-American bourbon barrels in the Bond store, and 2 of them were Wild Turkey and 2 of them were Maker's Mark, right?
Nice.
Why? Because I mean,
yeah.
But that was it, you know. And for an Australian distillery and you know, a modern single malt whiskey distillery to, you know, that uses second fill barrels, to completely ignore effectively the bourbon sort of wood policy was audacious, to say the least. But it was a very big step.
But you've tasted those, and do you feel like at some point this is a flavor that people need to check out, or do you just want to stick with what you have? And you really have kind of created, with this idea of using wine barrels exclusively, a very unique experience, because I don't know of another distillery that doesn't rechar their barrels, that they use wine barrels exclusively that are still wet when they're putting whiskey into them.
That's right. Look, and it's magical because it's bloody delicious. You know, I didn't know that at the time, right?
Yeah.
But it turned out to be a wonderful thing. But, you know, those 4 barrels, we've actually launched them. And I remember I actually drank the first one when I was in the States, and I texted employee number 1, who's now our heads up the whole production. You know, we wouldn't be Starward without him. And said, why didn't we make more of this bourbon?
Nice.
Like in all, you know, it was probably not rated for a live show, but like it was laden with a few expletives, saying because I didn't want to, which is true, and because I knew it would be delicious. I knew that ex-bourbon barrels with single malt whiskey. Are you kidding me? I mean, they're delicious, right?
Yeah.
But what have I got to say? Like, how am I going to like, what's the story I'm telling, and what's the reason why it has permission to be in that sharing cabinet? If it's a single malt whiskey aged in ex-American oak barrels, when we have these amazing wine barrels that are yielding such a different approach to whiskey making from a process perspective, but more importantly, like, create this amazingly delicious, really sippable whiskey, but also, which is really important for me personally, an amazingly, brilliantly mixable whiskey as well. Like, because wine, as we know, is like food friendly. So a whiskey aged in wine barrels, of course, is going to be really versatile in cocktails.
Yeah.
So it does these two, it kind of marries these two worlds in a wonderful way. And that was kind of the masterstroke. But aging in wine barrels, yeah, we bet the farm on it. It was all chips on 22 red kind of moment, and it could have completely broken us. But frankly, if it didn't work and we gave it a red hot go, I don't know that I would have then said, oh, well, let's just age whiskey in bourbon barrels.
Yeah.
I probably would have said, this is not a job that I'm capable of completing to the way that I envisioned it kind of turning out.
Yeah. So your wine barrels are all locally sourced?
Yeah, so there are days, typically from Victorian wineries, so northern Victoria, so the hot, dry climate, but also just at the foothills of like the Great Dividing Range, which is like cooler climate Shiraz and Cabernet and Pinot that kind of grow in those regions, and more traditional Shiraz and Cabernet in northern Victoria. And then to our west, we have South Australia, which is kind of famed for making amazing Shiraz and Cabernet casks. So we've got all of these barrels that we are able to source within a day's drive. Wine goes out and whiskey goes in within 24 hours, and then that full aging begins. Often, it's becoming more frequent now. We've kind of lined up great relationships with wineries, but we're not quite at the scale of being able to tell Penfolds when to disgorge their wine barrels. And so they'll basically say, look, we're emptying barrels on this date.
Yeah.
Do you want them? And, wine barrels as a substrate to age whiskey in is very, very different, not just because of the wine, but because of the wood policy of the winemaker when choosing the barrel from the cooperage. So there's French oak, obviously, that, we don't see a lot of in American whiskies.
Yeah.
There's American oak, but then, these are lightly toasted instead of charred. So that interaction with the wood's going to be very, very different. And also, the vintages, the number of vintages that a winemaker uses the wine barrel at the winery is going to make a big difference as well. So if you think about it, why is a winemaker using wine barrels or oak? It's to, create structure for the wine to age. And that structure comes from oak tannin. So we've got this wonderfully, how can I put it? We've got a really soft oak character coming through without all of that tannin that can create some astringency on the palate, because all of that tannin is in the wine.
Nice. That works.
And so like our engagement with the barrel is very different to different distilleries that are using brand new American oak or American bourbon barrels. It's softer, but with some added nuance of flavor from both the different types of wood, but also, of course, the wine that's in there. Now, as I was saying, if you're a winemaker that's dumping 400 barrels, we're not at the scale to be able to fill those barrels
immediately
fast enough before the wine turns into vinegar. And we don't want to age whiskey in vinegar barrels. Trust me.
Yes.
Ask me how I know why. So some of those barrels will be charred just because we're better off having the barrels in the bond store.
Yeah. And
just as the 50s and 100s kind of had a bit more depth of character and flavor, those charred wine barrels also have, we're still managing that light and shade, but rather than using size, we're using how much of the portfolio has been charred or not. So it's definitely the majority are all wet filled,
Yeah.
but we do have a percentage of them that are charred, because just from a logistics standpoint, we can't fill them all the time.
Yeah.
So, fine tuning all of that and getting it right, and sort of like, dialing in a product that, if we come back to those inspirations, is as consistent as Johnny Walker has been for the last 200 years. That's approachable like Maker's Mark. That's well crafted like the Belveni, and as distinctive as Lafroig is, right? You pop the cork on it and you know what you're drinking. Not as intense as Lafroig, but as distinctive as Lafroig.
Yeah.
And that, is category defining, as Wild Turkey is. That was kind of my mindset.
Yeah.
And I think after 15 years now of being in sort of like continually kind of fine tuning, we've kind of hit our stride with those whiskeys.
Nice. So I'm going to ask you some questions about your grains, but before I do, I don't want to forget to ask this, because when I was reading Tommy Doerr's Round the World book that he wrote in 1893-94, as he traveled the globe, the one place that he was most nervous about going to was Melbourne, Australia. And he said that the reason he was afraid to go there was because of all the snakes. Are there a lot of snakes?
Right.
Because you're on the edge of the outback. So are there a lot of snakes in Melbourne?
Well, I mean, it's an urban environment now, so less so.
Yeah.
But, back in the day, yeah, definitely. And, we kind of, it's interesting, snakes and spiders I guess they are a big deal. Not living there anymore, I can kind of understand why people get a little bit freaked out about all of this stuff. But when you're there, it's just part of like life, everyday life. So it's not that big of a deal. And you know what? If you leave them alone, and they'll leave you alone. They're only.
He said he said after all his worrying, he only saw one.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
He survived. That wouldn't have been good for Melbourne to have Tommy Doerr, bit and poisoned in.
Exactly.
So your grain is also locally sourced then. I noticed you also you have a Twofold whiskey which uses wheat as well.
Wheat. Yeah, so there's a tip of the hat to makers there, right? We did, we've got a 60% wheat, 40% malted barley release. It's called Twofold. It's still aged in those Australian wine barrels, a mixture of French oak and American oak, some charred, some not charred. 1, 2, 3 vintages at the winery, Cabernet, Pinot, Shiraz. The wonderful thing about our inventory is that, lots of whiskey distilleries love doing their single barrel programs. We could release a single barrel every week of the year and still not come back to the same type of barrel, let alone, nuances between one barrel to the next.
Yeah.
But Twofold, if Solera, the first whiskey we spoke of, is my sentimental favorite, Twofold, I guess, is the one that gets me out of bed every day. Not literally, but it's the one that gets me out of bed every day, because it's quite exciting to have a product that is so approachable, so delicious and easy to drink. And, if you're thinking about expanding your whiskey repertoire outside of the traditional whiskey making countries, and you start here, I feel like we're going to encourage you to explore the category even more, which is exciting.
Yeah.
And, I think what wheat does, as it does for great bourbons, is kind of give it some space and, some space to kind of let those wine characteristics come through, for you to kind of sample those, like the toasted oak, flavors from the barrel itself that come from the winery. And but it's still got a really strong cereal backbone, coming from both the malt and the wheat.
It's really interesting because I'm nosing it and tasted it earlier and kind of jotted down some notes on it. And all three that I got a chance to nose all had this nice, warm, it reminded me of baked goods. There was something about it that just had that really nice kind of comforting feeling, like you've got something baking in the oven. But this one also had kind of a It almost had a foresty kind of a smell to it. It's a kind of an herbally kind of spice, for
Yeah.
lack of a better term.
No, you're spot on. That's the French oak character coming through.
Okay.
So if you typically think of herbaceous whiskies, certainly American whiskies, we're in the rye camp. But this is really different, right? Like it's a lighter kind of herbaceousness that's not it's not poke you in the. I mean, I
Yeah.
love rye whiskeys, but like some of them can be quite
Yeah.
you know
Aggressive.
overwhelming with that spice and
Yeah.
herbaceousness. And I think that's rye. It's the rye grain that's doing that. Here, that spiciness, that herbaceous and spiciness is actually coming from the oak
Mm.
and the French oak.
All of them have a really nice mouthfeel to it. This one, though, is like, I don't know if it's because I just had coffee before I did my tastings, but I kept getting like this coffee with cream kind of a experience out of it. With the
Yeah, look, I think a lot of people kind of, particularly with Twofold, sort of talk about a creaminess, but not from a flavor point of view, but more from a
yeah,
textural perspective,
yeah,
right? Like that's quite mouth coating and round. Um, and look, I think a lot of people on Nova, the next one, pick up a mocha kind of characteristic on it.
yeah.
So given they're using the same wine barrels and that effectively, so I should point out the 60% wheat, 40% malted barley is separately distilled and aged,
Okay.
and then we marry them post maturation. And so the 40% malted barley that you're getting in Twofold is actually the Nova product.
Oh,
If that makes
okay.
sense.
Really interesting.
So we make substantially more Nova than we do Twofold to kind of to make both Twofold and Nova, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And then there's a nice little cinnamon to it. But another note I wrote down, and sometimes I'll go off from the standard tasting notes just if something hits me, it was like waffle. It was like having a waffle in the morning, the finish on it. It
Yeah.
was just, and I think that's a grain that was coming through on it, and probably the combination of
The baking spices.
yeah,
And sweetness.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Because there's a little cinnamon in there too that kind of rolls with that too. So that's really interesting. As I was tasting it, I was trying to pick out what was different about it from any other whiskeys that I had had because it was unique. And I think the thing is that there really is no char element to it. It didn't really have any of that kind of smoky, not peaty smoke, but kind of a charred barrel kind of a effect to it.
Right. Look, and what a wonderful kind of world now to discover, right? Like we've got all of these amazing ways of experiencing whiskey that are so different to the way Scotch and bourbon and Irish whiskey turn up.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of fun to sort of bring those to market. Because one of the things I was really worried about before we knew we could craft a whiskey like Twofold, for example, was that I didn't want to be the Aussie Shiraz of whiskey, like, poke you in the eyes with intense flavor. And if you think about virgin oak barrels that are sort of like straight from the cooperage and then aging whiskey, they can be a little intense, But the master stroke of all of this is that the wine has softened the barrel. The wine has taken out a lot of the astringency that we sometimes see in that virgin oak expression. And at the other end, there's lots of amazing wine distilleries that are doing wine finishes,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a different approach. Effectively, you're getting 2 hits of oak in that, right?
That's true.
You're getting the first aging process and then a finish in wine. So, funnily enough, those wine finishes that see a lot less time and contact with the wine barrel often turn out being more intense than this whiskey that's aged for the full period in red wine.
Yeah.
So it's been fascinating for me as a drinker to kind of discover all of this as well.
Yeah. So you're getting local barley. Do you malt the barley yourself, or do you have a malting house that does that for you?
Yeah. there's some bits of the process where it just sort of makes it, you've got to pick your battles, right? And for me, we're quite fortunate, and coming from that sort of brewing mindset, that there are lots of artisanal maltsters in Melbourne that are supporting the craft brewing scene. So we could work with those maltsters to dial in a spec that was neither brewing malt nor distilling malt in character, that just became the Starward spec, which effectively means that it has high diastatic power. It converts all of the complex carbohydrates into fermentable sugars, but it's also darker in color. That means that it creates that luscious mouthfeel that we were talking about, and those baked goods characteristics that you were talking about as well, because we're effectively sort of roasting the barley a little longer to get that darker colored grain. And just like coffee, the darker the roast, the more intense flavor that you'll get from it.
Yeah. And then I read that you were using a combination of brewers and distillers yeast.
Yeah.
Okay.
For the same reason, like we wanted to kind of make sure that all of that hard work we put into crafting this wort that we're going to then ferment was fully attenuated, that we got all the sugar and turned it into alcohol, but didn't miss a trick by using ale yeast to drive a lot of flavor. And so if you think of, for example, a Belgian ale compared to a lager, the flavor profile is very, the grain itself is the same.
Yeah.
Plus or minus. But it's the yeast that's kind of driving a lot of that different flavor coming through. And so inspired by that, we just took an approach of thinking about using ale yeasts to kind of drive more flavor into the spirit before it was aging, because I knew the time wasn't going to be on my side, that I needed to have a spirit that could step up to the intensity of the environment that it was in and still be in balance.
Yeah. So you had a very interesting beginning to what year did you get started with the distillery?
So officially we started in 2007.
Okay.
We were raising like it was my moment with Bill and his wife Lynn saying, okay, I think my ambitions for your business and your ambitions for your business are a little different. And I thought it would be a confrontational meeting, and they both kind of looked at me and said, look, we've been waiting for you to come to this realization for some time.
Nice.
You should set up your own distillery. And so with their blessing, we started Starward to kind of fulfill that idea of a sharing cabinet whiskey that should be in every bar around the world and in home bars too,
Okay. And then you have an interesting location for the distillery.
Yeah. So, we were it's really interesting. I think that there are a lot of people, me included, that get really captivated by process and the maker's world, right? And I am too, but I knew very early on that I didn't really have much to say, because all we did when we launched was make a whiskey. And we knew it was going to take some time. I didn't know how long. And that even when we did get started, that our focus should be in the drinker's world, and that the home of this whiskey was Melbourne's restaurants and bars, not the distillery itself. And so I took a really pragmatic approach to thinking about, where am I going to distill? Was actually after visiting the Hangar One distillery in Alameda in San Francisco that I thought, well, we've got a secondary airport close to the distillery. I wonder if they've got any space there. So we started making whiskey in an old Qantas maintenance hangar.
Wow.
About 4 miles from my home, which was great because I used to get up at 5:45 in the morning, literally get to the distillery at 6 a.m., turn the stills around from the overnight run, get them going, do the fores cut, the heads cut, then have enough time to drive home, have breakfast with the kids, get them off to school, and then drive back to the distillery in time for the tails cut. And so just being close to home was really valuable with young children. I didn't have a story to tell. It's, security at an airport's pretty good. supply of power is pretty good at an airport. You don't want a power outage at an airport, and it was right by a highway. So it had all of the key things that, we needed. And they were very, very, very generous and friendly landlords as well. Like, we were able to kind of negotiate, a very accommodating lease arrangement that sort of scaled as we kind of went along, understanding that the early years of a whiskey distillery are very lean in terms of operations, but ideally, longer term, things will turn a corner. And, I can say it now, there were we were 30 days away from insolvency for a year and a half. And if it weren't for their generosity of just saying, don't make fools of us. We're not a bank. We don't want you to fail just because you can't make this rent. We're going to be fine without your rent for a period of time.
Wow.
And it all turned out great. And so, working with the airport was one of many lucky moments in the history of Starward.
Now, you had also, I had read that you initially started selling barrels of whiskey to people and then buying them back.
Yeah. So the challenge with production and sort of being in the sharing cabinet is that you want to be at a price point that means that people aren't going to be like, oh, I'm not too sure if you're worthy of this whiskey, right? Like that happens, right? And I wanted to avoid that. So I had in my mind that, if we could be, with Twofold at a maker's mark price point, then we've got a chance, right? Like, it won't be prices to the reason why we fail. And the challenge with that isn't, the challenge is scale. It's that simple. Like barley, grains are a commodity. Utility prices are generally kind of universal, right?
Yeah.
It's all of the overheads that you have in running a distillery that kind of mean that you're either paying $80 or $100 a bottle or $30 a bottle in sake. So I decided to scale up, but I just didn't have the capital available to be able to do that. I don't have that deep of a pocket. So I came up with this idea, which was modeled on something that I saw with lumber, believe it or not, where people that were air drying lumber would basically create a future for it and sell it today per board foot at one price, and then buy it back off the person that had purchased it at a board foot price at a premium. And it would sort of be like a certificate of deposit sort of arrangement.
Nice.
Right? And so we were able to do that for the first 3 or 4 years. But then, very quickly, my role became selling barrels of whiskey as opposed to, thinking about building a brand, And so there's an interesting inflection point where that program doesn't necessarily make sense anymore. And so that's when we sought more formal investment to kind of help us scale up.
Yeah. It's very interesting because, distillers have to make some tough decisions early on to figure out how they're going to survive through time when they're waiting for whiskey to age. And that was probably one of the more unique ones that I've heard. So
yeah, it is a unique way of doing it. And look, I think they've been doing similar sorts of programs without the promise to buy back in Scotland for quite some time. But my thinking was like, no, I want the whiskey. I just can't borrow from a bank, so I'm just going to borrow from you.
Yeah.
And you do it one barrel at a time.
So this is the Nova that I'm now. Would you call this your flagship?
Yeah, it's interesting. They're all my kids, so I love them equally, right? And they've all got a role to play. But this, I guess, is, when we talk about the French oak, the American oak, all of those sorts of things, it's the epitome of all of those barrels kind of combined into one grand cru, right? Mm-hmm. We're talking wine terms, and so it highlights just the depth and complexity that's available from whiskies aged in wine barrels, without the intensity, which is a real key point for me, right? I didn't want it to be too intense that people were like, oh, geez, well, that's a novelty. It's interesting. I'm glad I tried it, but I'm going to take a pass next time. I wanted to avoid that.
Yeah.
And so it's still got all the hallmarks of a great whiskey in terms of that balance between spirit, the wine flavors, and the oak. It's really important to have that balance. but it just kind of approaches it from a different perspective of like, uncharred oak barrels and red wine being the previous use as opposed to, say, for example, charred American oak barrels.
Yeah. This one is the grain is always there. It's like it's always kind of tying it all together. But I get more of the fruit and kind of berry kind of a nose out of this one that kind of complements that. It was very
Absolutely.
It was very subtle the first time I nosed it because I think I tried the Solera first and then came to this, and then this was a bit more subtle, and I had to kind of walk away from it and come back because and then once I did, I'm like, wow, there's a whole bunch of stuff here that I wasn't nosing before.
Yeah, absolutely. The fruit profile, and even if you go back, I think to Twofold, you'll see more of the fruit after you've nosed it in Nova.
Yeah.
Like it sort of presents itself. And look, water is Starward's friend. These are quite low proof whiskies. They're at 80 and 82 proof, right? So they're not kind of big baller whiskies that you kind of having with a big cube of ice and a cigar. I mean, you can, but like my point is that they're quite nuanced and delicate, and water's helped them do that. And part of the reason for that is climate. Coming back to where we started, we actually go into barrel at a lower proof point, and I think also the wine barrels. Like the more water you add to them, the more they open up as well. So we didn't necessarily want to create something that I wanted it to be ready to drink.
Yeah.
I guess.
So I almost want to say on the palate, this is a Southern whiskey. And the reason why I say this is a Southern whiskey is because around me, people talk about nanner pudding. Have you ever heard of nanner pudding?
No, I love the food references to different states in the United States. It's been fascinating. I could write a book about it. Like, all the different kind of cuisines that that I've never heard of that people kind of use as the reference point. Tell me about.
It's like banana pudding. It's with vanilla wafers in it, and so you get the vanilla. I get the banana is really, and then the really creamy mouthfeel on top of that just kind of adds to that whole experience. And then you get a little kind of a cinnamon red hot effect on the finish as it's completing its journey. But yeah, I mean, it's you get a mouthful of it and it's like, oh yeah, I know that.
Yeah.
I know that taste.
So the banana, interestingly enough, it comes from that fermentation and using that ale yeast we talked about before.
Okay.
So you can see how it's sort of like traveling all the way through the production process.
Yeah, that's amazing. I have to go for a second taste because that's one of my favorite flavors. So
yeah.
I like that. All right, let's talk a little bit about what's going on with you guys now, because you just actually became the official whiskey partner of the Michelin Guide in North America. How did that happen?
Yeah, look, it's been amazing, to kind of work with Michelin chefs and sort of get them to be inspired by Starward as much as it is a finished drink, but as an ingredient in a great drink, right? And working with those beverage directors in restaurants. And I think, and if we come back to, I'm sure something you'd have an observation on, Drew, that, all great whiskies talk to the place they're made, right? Like, I mean, that's kind of default, like we talk about the origins of the whiskey and the place. But to me, the best whiskies in the world talk to the culture of the place it's made as much as it does the ingredients and the location and climate. And Melbourne has, we were just talking about this off air before, has been, been influenced by waves of migrations, we're talking from gold rush times, as we talked about beforehand. A huge Chinese population arrived then, obviously, with the Scots, Irish and British kind of colonization of Australia at that point in time. But, post-war, there was my family of origins from Sicily. So there's lots of Italians, lots of Greeks. In fact, Melbourne's the largest Greek city outside of Athens. That's how many
Wow.
Greeks are in Melbourne. Lebanese, Taiwanese, Thai, you name it. Like, it's a cornucopia of like an amazing, diverse melting pot of cultures. And that's best reflected in the food scene. It's created this environment that I think exists. I think there's a Melbourne in every city, right? Like, just in terms of little pockets of things, but we just kind of have it in suburbs as much as we do the city itself. This approachability to cuisine that's very, very, very lacks airs and graces. It doesn't have that sort of fine dining, white linens, silver service that you might see in London or Paris. But the quality of the food and the intention behind it is best in class. And so for me, when we were thinking about bringing this product to market, and, coming back to my history, like growing up, whiskey wasn't a thing for me. It was just what we, Shivers Regal 12 was what we gave our accountant for Christmas. That was it,
Yeah.
Yeah. So, for me, kind of thinking about, well, how am I going to introduce whiskey to my family, my extended family, 60 cousins and all those sorts of things? It was with food. That's our common gathering place. And so from day one, Starward, because of Melbourne and because of my origins, was a whiskey that, should be, enjoyed with food, and, Three Fingers need a bit of a push. But, once we start to think about the fact that, well, we're aging in wine barrels, wine we know is food friendly. So, of course, a whiskey aged in wine barrels is going to be the most food friendly whiskey of all, right? Like, it makes sense. And, there's a great versatility to the whiskey that comes from those wine barrels that mean that when we work with Michelin restaurants and their beverage partners, I'm blown away by where they take the whiskey, because that's what I do. Is I take it for a walk. I'm, that's a cast member, you're the director, put it to work, and craft something that's amazing. And so, the wonderful thing for me has been that we've found some kindred spirits with these Michelin restaurants that are kind of pushing the boundaries of cuisine, that are really kind of thinking quite about food in a modern context, whether that's about sustainability, about farm to table, whether it's about just turning things on their head a little bit, from what traditions look like. And that's our world, right? Like, that's exactly who we are as a company and a brand, and something that, we want to work with them. So the way that kind of turned out is, obviously you can find Starward in Michelin restaurants, which is exciting, but more importantly for me is that we're starting to kind of share and collaborate with those restaurants with a video series that sort of inspires people to think about whiskey differently and bring it to the table.
So a video series would be something that where would you access that?
I wish it was on Netflix, but for the time being, it's going to be on YouTube. And, if you register at starward.com or for our newsletter, then we'll just ship you the next link of it as they become available throughout the year.
Nice. And so once you started diving in yourself into this world of pairings, did you find a perfect combo for each of your whiskeys?
I knew you were going to ask this.
Well, because pairing is a challenge for me. There are times chocolate I can do it with, but nothing else.
But you were just talking about flavor profiles before, right?
Yeah.
So we maybe, and it depends whether we're talking neat or with the drink, right? Because once we start thinking about a drink, you can kind of use some of the adjuncts to the drink itself to kind of influence where you go with flavor. So if you're doing Thai, then maybe a whiskey mule, like with ginger and some lemongrass, kind of sends you down the Thai path, right?
Yeah.
But neat, I love Twofold with donuts.
Okay. Any particular kind? Just plain cake donuts, or?
Oh, iced glazed
Okay.
donuts.
Okay.
Yeah.
What we call
I'm not going to
Krispy Kremes over here.
yeah, you said it, not me. And then neat Nova is great. I mean, you can't beat it with a steak. Like just being really traditional from that perspective, as a neat serve. Twofold, if we're getting into kind of mains, entrees, is great with like sashimi and sushi as well, right?
Okay.
Like that clean kind of flavor. And then coming back to your dessert kind of reference earlier, Solera is so there's an Italian Christmas cake called panettone, and it's just basically the Italian version of a British Christmas pudding, but instead of all of those dark dried fruits, it's very light, airy. You raise the dough for 3 days, so it's very light and airy, and has candied fruits in it, bright dried fruits in it. And so that to me is Solera in a nutshell.
Yeah.
So that's my go-to with Solera.
I think my challenge with pairing food comes from my history when I used to work in paint, because I try to, you're blending colors, you're trying to find colors that work with other colors. Sometimes you don't want them to work with other, you want them to contrast to create more. So I take that kind of thought process, and when I go into food, my brain starts to cramp up, because I go, if I am taking a whiskey that, say, has a heavy vanilla banana component to it, I could put it with banana pudding, but if I do, then I'm almost canceling out the flavors in the whiskey. Maybe it uncovers another flavor that I wasn't getting out of the whiskey, but it feels like maybe I need to find something that's chocolate over on this side to pair with banana and vanilla.
Absolutely. So there's a really good tool that I'm going to give you. It's called the Flavor Thesaurus.
Yeah.
The book, and it does what the cover says, and gives you the ability to look at complements to different flavors.
Okay.
It's great, and we've got a wonderful flavor wheel on the front of it with different contrasting flavors, and you kind of go from one side of the wheel to the other like you do a color wheel.
Yeah.
And there's no surprise that bacon is on one end, and lo and behold, apple is on the other. Right?
Oh, that's great.
So, it's great. But then, adjacent to bacon are all of those sort of like, meaty kind of characters. So it's kind of gives you like both the thesaurus and the what's the word I'm looking? The synonyms or antonyms.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah, that's great, because that's what I loved about the color wheel, was that you could say, as you're blending paint, you could say, if I take red and I look on the opposite end of the spectrum at blue, if I need to get some red out, I add green, because green has blue and yellow, which will cancel out the red. It grays it, is what it does. And I thought, man, it'd be great if you could do that with food, but any whiskey pairing or any whiskey wheel you see, they're not set up that way.
No, they're not. So you need to kind of be a bit more inventive and like use the flavors. Flavor Thesaurus is a great resource from that perspective. And, I guess that's kind of my ambition for Starward, is that it is used as an ingredient as much as it is a drink,
Yeah.
And that, food lovers kind of become a little bit inspired to take it for walks that they wouldn't otherwise do with certainly whiskeys, but perhaps even other spirits, but, an easy way to start is to say, well, what rum cocktails could I make with whiskey?
Yeah.
What gin cocktails could I make with whiskey? And, some of them work and some of them don't. But, for example, one that does with Twofold is Twofold and tonic, so, it shouldn't work.
Yeah.
Right. Don't do it with bourbon. It's not that great, but you do it with Twofold, and those wine characters and the quinine in the tonic kind of just pair up magically, and it's just a delicious drink.
Interesting. So the last one on my list is the Solera.
Yeah.
Okay. And so is there a particular type of barrel that you said you use for this?
Yeah, so it's still a wine barrel, but these are fortified wine barrels. So this
Okay.
is using the vat method that we discussed very early on. And basically, the idea is that we have, um, yeah, every single barrel of fortified wine that we've ever filled is in your glass right now, or that we've ever emptied, I should say.
Yeah.
And it's very consistent from batch to batch. This is my, so there's about $1 million worth of whiskey that we never sell, right? Like it's just sitting in this. So I call it my $1 million promise to consistency because, just like Johnny Walker has been able to kind of craft a whiskey that over the years has changed, no doubt, but it's still Johnny Walker Black. I've had the privilege of tasting some from the 60s, 90s, and noughties and today, and you can thread a needle through
Still
it.
has
Like
the same. Nice.
so that was kind of the inspiration behind that. Because I know a lot of craft distilleries and drinkers of craft whiskey were always frustrated by the fact that, I really like that last release, but this one's just not quite in the pocket,
Yeah. Yeah.
We just want to remove that because now I can say, well, 80% of this is exactly the same as the previous batch. So, it's in the pocket. And the beautiful thing is just become more of what it is. So this has a lovely lingering mouth feel to it as well. And the flavors kind of just keep going. Those fortified wine barrels are most like sherry, but obviously sherry comes from Spain. In Australia, that fortified wine is called a pera, like aperitif.
Okay.
And so, yeah, bright dried fruits, like I said earlier, lots of candied characteristics. Stone fruits come through, a bit more banana. I think you'll get on this as well.
I said, actually, the finish to me was chocolate covered banana.
There you go. Yeah, that's a great description.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. So,
And the grain is still there. I got apple crumb cake actually on the beginning. I got very much into food names when I was
right.
nosing these.
Yeah. So that's the thing, like for us, I think a food vocabulary is a really helpful tool, and the trick is, as you pointed out, Drew, to think of like, okay, what's a complement to that food flavor that I've got in the drink already, that I can kind of accentuate all of these other flavors with and just make a wonderful drink.
What is the weirdest
Or
thing?
pairing.
What is the weirdest food you've ever paired with a whiskey?
Oh. Um,
I'm thinking
it's
from.
pretty predictable. It's actually at a Scotch Whisky Society event. The food was weird because I'd never had it before. Not that the pairing was weird, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But haggis is something that, like, let's just say it's an acquired taste.
Yes. Yeah. So you had it paired. Do you remember the whiskey it was paired with?
Yeah, it was the Glenfiddich 15-year-old. So they do a Solera with that as well, which is
Okay.
yeah.
That's interesting. Well, people laugh at me, but I actually look forward to going to Scotland partially because you wake up with Scottish breakfast at your B&B, and they always have black pudding and haggis, and I always eat the black pudding and the haggis. Now, I will say that haggis is one of those things that if it's made well, it can be
Sure.
good, and if it's not made well, then I'm probably not going to eat it.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And this was made well, but it was just very, it's one of those moments where you just have to suspend, like, understanding what it is that you're eating and just enjoy the flavor.
Yeah.
of it.
I did that with some friends of mine who came up from North Carolina when I lived in Philadelphia. We had scrapple. Have you ever had scrapple?
No,
Okay. Do you know what scrapple is?
no.
So scrapple is basically all the leftover parts of the pig ground up with cornmeal.
Wow.
It's delicious, but you don't want to know what's in it. Now I'm thinking, what whiskey could I pair with scrapple?
Wow. Yeah.
That'll be an interesting one. So
Yeah.
what's next for you guys?
We've got an exciting year planned. Look, one of the things I guess we've all kind of felt is a little bit, a bit of cabin fever, and so as a brand, we really haven't been able to do the outreach that we've wanted to do face to face with people that are curious about whiskey and that want to kind of learn more about Australian whiskey and Starward. So stay tuned. We're going to be doing way more masterclasses and events across the United States. We've got a few limited release products coming out. So there's going to be some more Solera coming in time for Father's Day. We've got a couple of single barrels that we've got on offer, and our first single estate whiskey. So this is whiskey aged in wine barrels from one vintage and one winery. So that's going to be a lot of fun.
Okay, nice. And where are you guys available in the United States?
So, depending on retail, like different retails, we're available across 32 different states. You can kind of go to our website and order in, more than 30 states now. So that's great. But the key markets that we're available in terms of retail are the northeastern states: Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, DC, Maryland, and then Illinois, Washington State, California. I'm kind of doing the rounds. Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and Florida.
I'm telling you, there's a lot of Americans that probably couldn't name off that many states.
Yeah.
You've done well. You've done well.
Thank you.
Well, and so what's the web address?
The web address is www.starward.com.
Okay.
And yeah, I think have a look at the store if there's anything that's, if you're not in those states and can't find a retailer, there's a store finder there as well. And subscribe to the email database, and we'll keep you up to date with those new releases as they come out.
Very good. Well, Dave, it's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for introducing the audience to Australian whiskey history, because, again, sometimes it's nice to have a little foundation and know that this isn't just an industry that's popped up out of nowhere, that there is a legacy to it, although that legacy got interrupted somewhere down the road. But, sometimes we have to take a break, as we did here in the States, and
exactly, yeah,
make our way back. So, thank you for sharing some whiskey with me and an opportunity to taste the terroir of a completely different continent. That's a lot of fun.
Yeah, cheers, Drew. It's been fun.